Paperback Rocker, episode 93. Hey, this is Matt Severson, the Paperback Rocker, and I'm broadcasting from my 6x9 foot cinder block shack in the desert of northern Mexico, southern Texas. Welcome and thanks for checking out my show.
Here he is, the master of the Stratocaster, the Paperback Rocker.
Hey everybody, what's up? It's your old friend Matt. I'm back again with another volume, another installment, another episode of the Blue Whiskey novel, a book I wrote some years ago now, about 4 years ago, I think, before I jumped fully into full immersion back into making music, which was my first love. So I don't really feel guilty about returning to it and kind of putting books on the back burner. But I know I can always return to writing books if I ever have the time. And I actually thought of a great idea for a new novel this morning. So maybe that is what it will take to get me writing again. But enough of that. When we last read in Blue Whiskey, which is available on Amazon, by the way, and is available on Kindle. I put it on sale today. I put all my books on sale today for the holiday season. Pick up a copy of the Kindle or the hardback, in this case, Blue Whiskey novel. You can contact me directly at paperbackrocker@live.com if you'd like to get a copy sent directly to you from me, signed and paid for via PayPal by you. Okay, when we last read, as I was saying, Our Heroes, I should have called this book The Rise and Fall of Stanton Wheelhouse. I thought of that this morning too, because that would be a good reference, harken back to one of my favorite my favorite albums I listened to a couple days ago, which is David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust. But it is not called that. It's called Blue Whiskey. And when we last read, Reuben and our hero, Stanton Wheelhouse, were trekking, journeying, and they were traveling back from New Orleans to Greenwich Village. And that is precisely where we pick up right now on page 206 as our heroes, Reuben and Stanton, arrive back in New York City. Arriving back at the village, not much had changed by appearances, but there was a buzz in the air. Something unseen was spinning like a vortex. At the center of it was Bob Dylan. I'll explain shortly. Reuben and Benjamin reunited famously, and now all three of us were living above the hardware shop, which was being transformed by 12-hour days of work into a music club. I had nothing to do with that transformation. I stayed upstairs, writing song after song and searching for perfection. I almost found it. One day Ben interrupted my practicing. I heard him come up the stairs, but I continued playing the song I was working on until the end. It was a way to get some feedback without soliciting it. From the doorway behind me, Ben said, Stanton, that was amazing. Something on your mind? I asked. I can sense when those close to me are distressed. Ben didn't speak, but came into the room and sat on my cot and looked out the window down onto the alley. How can you write such beautiful music looking down on a dirty alley? He asked. The inspiration comes from within, not from the alley, I said. I'm in a trance when I'm playing. The tunnel, he said. Yep, it's getting deeper too, or stronger. It's hard to describe. I can see it on your face when you play. We stared down at the alley for a while. Finally, I said, "You seem depressed." "I am. Tomorrow's the big sale, all my father's stock. It's mostly junk, I know, but it's hard to let go." "Did you talk to Reuben about it?" "Reuben didn't know my father like you did." My heart swelled. I was still young, and it was the first time anybody had come to me for advice. "Well, let's think about it," I said. "Let's ask old Chaim some questions." "Like what?" I looked up at the ceiling and said kind of dramatically, "Old Chaim, do you want your son to succeed?" I turned away and said in a small, distant voice, "Yes." Again I looked to the ceiling and said, "Do you want your beloved son Benjamin to live the same life as you?" I turned and in the same voice as before said, "I want my son to live his own life." I looked to the ceiling for a final time and said, "What should your beloved son do with the stock of the hardware store?" I turned one last time and said in the same voice, "Sell the shit and get out of the hardware business." Both of us burst out laughing. "Did he really say that?" asked Ben through weeping eyes. "Sounded like Chaim to me," I said. The record album called Bob Dylan was released in March of 1962. Only about 2,500 people purchased it at the time, one of them being Reuben, who loved it. I never thought highly of the album. It was Dylan, but it wasn't Dylan. Let me explain. In the 60s, it was common for first albums to be heavily populated with cover songs. For example, Bob Dylan's eponymous album contained only 2 originals. The Rolling Stones' 1964 debut had but a single one of their own. Somewhat an exception, the Beatles' Please Please Me was released in 1963 with 8 Lennon-McCartney tracks out of 14. And that's what I meant when I said it was Dylan, but it wasn't. That couldn't be said for his sophomore release, the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. That album had 11 self-composed songs, and they were head splitters. Blowin' in the Wind, Masters of War, and my favorite, A Hard Rain's a Gonna Fall, are the most notable. I must state for the record that many of Dylan's songs during his early days were traditional melodies with new words. Some might call that plagiarism. Others might call it passing along history via the oral tradition. Some years later, a band called Led Zeppelin did the same thing with the blues. Dylan's second album dropped on Greenwich Village like an atomic bomb. If it was a flop, I would have just called it a bomb. I didn't do that. The word zeitgeist is a word you've no doubt heard and read, and it applies fittingly to the Village after the release of the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. Let me delve into it more deeply. I hope it will convey what it was like to be there at the time. Zeitgeist is roughly translated as spirit of the time. That's a very loose definition. Does it refer to purely intellectual matters or to the popular fashion and culture? The answer is yes. Literalists have argued with me, saying it refers only to the dominant thinking of a period. In my opinion, the zeitgeist is the embodiment of popular culture as a whole. It's a pretty easy position for me to defend when confronted with the argument that it is solely a function of intellectualism. To that I rebut, is a common thinking not accompanied by a common style? Is the context of the 1920s complete without the architecture and even the design of light fixtures? I propose that the greatest such movement in the modern era took place in the 60s. It culminated at Woodstock and will never be matched. It was a combination of anti-war and anti-establishment thinking, combined with a unified artistic vision across music, movies, and literature. That which wasn't united with the dominant themes of the decade was still part of the zeitgeist, because in everything there is duality. There were plenty of establishment dinosaurs I could give as examples of this equally necessary anti-zeitgeist, but they are to the time what the Encyclopedia Britannica is to the Internet. The 70s zeitgeist was a close second to the 60s, and I prefer it, although I admit it wasn't as influential. Rock and roll plateaued then, and comedy may have as well. It's hard to beat the early years of Saturday Night Live. The necessary duality was obvious in the popular music. It's fashionable to write off disco as disposable culture, but it was sure as hell a movement. The 80s were an anti-zeitgeist, in my opinion, because the decade was degenerative. The compact disc ushered in a digital culture that made obsolete the delicate analog recordings we once treasured. Colorful, shiny things were de rigueur and attracted people like schools of headband-wearing fish. Yes, there were many great things in the 80s, but they were exceptions rather than the norm. The John Hughes films stand out. There was some good music, but it was the exception. The production sensibilities of the era date the sound of 80s albums worse than any other decade, making them like pictures from the awkward years growing up. The 90s had a unified movement in the Seattle grunge scene, and I was caught up in it when the popular bands cited me as an influence and covered my songs. My album sales surged, and I made guest appearances at Soundgarden and Pearl Jam concerts. The accompanying fashion of denim and flannel and combat boots was right up my alley, too, since I gave up blouses for a more masculine look 4 or 5 years into my career. This will be the only mention of my activities during that decade because I have decided this volume of my autobiography should be limited to the early days of my career. But the grunge days were special to me. There have been no zeitgeist movements since then, which directly correlates to the existence of the Internet. I believe it will be nearly impossible for another one to form due to the vast and varied amount of information available now. 3 people who like to dress up as squirrels and eat pecans can now find each other and form their own society. Focus is now centered on the self. Zeitgeist is dead. Reuben and Ben's club, named Hardware, opened with yours truly headlining the event. 2 other folkies played sets before mine, but you wouldn't recognize their names. It was my first appearance since returning from New Orleans, and I was happy to see a good turnout of people who, judging by their reaction, were fans. That night I met the girl who later became my first serious girlfriend, and I kept in touch with her for the next year before we started dating. Her name was Edie Sedgwick. She introduced herself to me, and after Ben and Reuben shut down Hardware for the night, the 2 of us set out walking. We strolled and talked until the sun came up. She told me her life story, which was amazing. She was only 20, but she had lived an interesting life. I never let her know I was younger than her. She grew up on a ranch, and her family had their own schoolhouse on the property. She had just been released from a hospital for treatment of anorexia, which I had never heard of. Edie was in town visiting her brother, Minty, but he had gotten drunk early the previous day and remained in that state. So she had wandered around the city out of boredom and found me playing at Hardware. She lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so we wrote letters back and forth until she moved to New York. We dated until Andy Warhol came into our lives. At that point, I was a little too normal for her, and she drifted into Warhol's factory, never to return. In case you are unfamiliar, the factory was Warhol's studio, which doubled as a hangout for hipsters and speed freaks, among many others. Bands like the Velvet Underground provided the soundtrack, and graphic movies masquerading as art films were recorded and screened there. Many of the factory's most famous and flamboyant regulars met ugly ends. Speaking of that, Minty hanged himself on the day before his 26th birthday. Edie got into drugs after that to numb the pain. I introduced Bob Dylan to Edie in December of that traumatic year. Edie and I were drinking in the upstairs bar at the Kettle of Fish on McDougal Street, and she was upset, talking about Minty. Bob came in with a man I had yet to meet, a folk musician from Cambridge named Bob Newworth. Newworth and Edie recognized each other, so we all sat together and conversed, puffing cigarettes like smokestacks, thanks to the omnipresent black beauties. Okay, I'm going to stop right there, and I will be immediately recording a second episode and producing it today, so it will come out the middle of this week for sure, because I like to have 2 of these 15-minute-ish length episodes for you each week, free of charge. Although if you ever feel like donating to offset the costs of the show, simply make a PayPal donation of any amount to the address of paperbackrocker@live.com through paypal.com. Okay, but you don't have to. It's still going to be here for your enjoyment. Hope you're enjoying the book, and I hope you'll be with me for the next episode. And we're getting pretty close to finishing this book. It's not that far away. Then we'll have to start the next one on the Paperback Rocker Show.
The Paperback Rocker has signed off.